weather, but nobody does anything about it. And we economists are a bit like that, that we talk about market efficiency and what a wonderful world this would be if markets were truly efficient. But for the most part, we don't do anything about it. But Jack Bogle is a guy who really has done something about it, that he's created this Vanguard Group, these low-cost index mutual funds, and he's railed against this misinformation and the lies and ignorance that people are subject to in financial markets. And so he's really unclogged the channel from saving to productive investment. And he's made us all better off as investors, as workers who have better capital stock to work with, as consumers who get better products, and very grateful to Jack. I was on an airplane heading to a meeting at the Vanguard Funds where Jack was going to talk, and mentioned this to my seatmate, and quick as a wink he said, "Oh, St. Jack." Well, I think Jack really deserves this honorific for making the American economy a much better, more productive place. And so I'm going to introduce Steve Thorpe, who had the bright idea of inviting Jack down and has made all of this possible. And let me say, I'm just delighted to see you all here today.
Thank you very much, Ed, and thank you, everybody, for coming. Just a couple logistics things. This meeting is being recorded. Thank goodness we finally appear to have gotten the technology worked out. And our intent is to post it onto YouTube later, provided we get all that transfer worked out. So John C. Bogle is the founder and former chairman of the Vanguard Group, which now manages over $3 trillion of assets worldwide. St. Jack made low-cost index mutual funds available to investors through Vanguard. He increased investor return. He forced other mutual fund companies to follow, and he helped to grow the American economy. It all started with his Princeton senior thesis, The Economic Role of the Investment Company. So today we have the good fortune to be with Mr. Bogle for until 1:15. He's going to have to leave us promptly at 1:15. So he agreed to talk with us first about this question. After 40 years, Vanguard is now the world's largest mutual fund company with more in assets. How did you get there? So he'll present on that for a while, and then we'll open it up for open Q&A for as long as we have until no later than 1:15. So with that introduction, please join me in welcoming Mr. John C. Bogle.
Well, thank you all so very much. You know, the speaker is never supposed to argue with the introducers, but to both Ed and to Steve, I have to say not only thank you for organizing all this, but to make it very clear, the saint I ain't. And if you don't believe that, just ask my wife of 58 years and she will confirm my vision. So I'm happy to welcome all of you. Thanks to Kimberly Brown down there for setting it up, and right at my side here in Philadelphia is Michael Nolan, who's also done just a great job for me as my particularly staff assistant. So I want to welcome you all before I get to the question. Duke students, Bogleheads, I guess there's some there. I don't know if any faculty came, but I welcome you if you were there. And anybody else interested in the subject, anybody, other investors, I'm always happy to talk to investors. And if they're Vanguard shareholders, which it turns out quite a few of them are usually, thank you very much for paying my salary all these years. Now, to the students, I want to add a note. You know, it must be pretty obvious just by looking at the video that I'm getting in the waning years of a long, long career that goes back to 1951. It's almost 64 years now. And to the students, I just say, I really envy you. And you've got your lives ahead, you've got your careers ahead, and you've got a world filled with enough challenges to keep you busy for the rest of your days. And so I do envy you, and I wish you all a special success and good luck in the world. Certainly I've had my share of good luck, including I'm lucky to be with you today, not only here and indirectly on the Duke University campus, but also here on this globe, because 19 years ago this February, I had a heart transplant. I've now had my new heart for 19 years, 19 kind of magical years, busy years, giving me a life to continue my life's work. So I feel very, very lucky. Now, let's talk about how did we get from where we were to where we are today. And I guess the first thing anybody should know, particularly you entrepreneurs, potential entrepreneurs in the audience, is we got there the hard way. I got fired from my job at Wellington Management Company. I was the president of the company. I made the stupidest merger in the history of mergers in the United States of America. Yes, it was even worse than AOL Time Warner. And the result of my stupidity seemed like a good idea at the time. I won't go into explanations for it because it's all over. But so I lost my job, and I had to figure out how to recover my career. And I decided to go a new route to try and persuade the directors of our mutual funds that they should not let the directors of our management company, a separate company in the way this business works, fire their president. I was fired as president of Wellington Management Company. Actually, it turns out late at night on January 26, 1974. Was on a train at 6 o'clock in the morning to New York the next day, where the fund directors were meeting. It was a tiring day, I'll tell you that, and with a proposal that they free themselves of control of Wellington Management Company and have their own officers and staff. And so it was to happen. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's how Vanguard began. So it began actually with a remarkable, really a remarkable, what I call in the article I've just written for the Journal of Portfolio Management, the 40th anniversary issue, a remarkable fortnight, 14 nights, 2 weeks in September of 1974. On September 26th, I incorporated Vanguard. That's Vanguard's birthday, 9/26/74. Shortly after that, I opened the first edition of Journal of Portfolio Management, and there was an article by Paul Samuelson, Nobel laureate, distinguished economist, according to the New York Times, the greatest economist of the 20th century, and indeed he was, with an article saying, it was called Challenge to Judgment, saying he couldn't find any evidence mutual fund managers could win consistently. Therefore, why wouldn't somebody start an index fund or an all-market fund, as he calls it then? And I opened that, and I thought, that looks like I've been following the index idea since my senior thesis at Princeton University back in 1951, believe it or not, where I even talked about index funds. And finally, that gave me the impetus to take Vanguard on this new route, this new company on a new route. And then about 3 or 4 days after that, at long last, the unremitting 50% decline in the stock market reached its bottom. It was a great time to be bearish, but it was in fact, of course, the time to be bullish. You know, it's always darkest before the dawn, as the saying goes. So we have those three things happening at once, and then we all of a sudden have a path to the future. It was slow in Vanguard and basically negative. The assets Vanguard acquired, mutual fund assets, as our separation from Wellington Management Company, was $1.4 billion, and with a huge vote of confidence in this new structure, this new way of looking at things in the mutual fund industry, a totally different way, running funds for investors instead of managers. The investors loved that so much that they took money out of that $1.4 billion for 3 consecutive years, or 4, maybe $400 billion in total, left our doors as a result of that great vision. And the high point, or maybe I should say the low point, was when Forbes ran an article about the separation of Wellington Management Company, my former company, and the new Vanguard. They called it a plague on both your houses. And they actually apologized for that later on. Maybe 30 years later, it took them a while to figure out what had happened. Everybody's different. And actually, Bill Baldwin, the editor, somewhere along the way, was in my office the other day doing an interview, and he apologized again. So I think that's my fourth apology for Forbes, and I'm glad to accept them with grace, I hope. I could have said, I hope, I told you so, but I avoid doing that. So the early years were really tough, very difficult to get along. Index fund went nowhere. We brought that out, formed it in 1975. And talk about a bad merger, as I did before. It was probably the worst underwriting, biggest underwriting flop, IPO flop in the history of the markets. And the underwriters had promised $150 million, big at the time, and they gave us $11 million. $11 million was all it produced. It was a flop. And so they came to me, and I said, you know, I can't even buy round lots of all 500 stocks. And they said, well, you know, maybe it would be best if we just gave everybody their money back. And I said, wait a minute. We have the world's first index fund, and we're going to build from here. And it took a long time. You know, you look back in time and see indexing growing from maybe 0% of our assets, obviously, in 74, to 3 or 4%, even as late as 1990. And then by 1999, 42% of our assets. And now indexing is the driver at Vanguard. 71% of our asset base are in index funds. So we have become primarily an index company. We can talk about that and its variations a little bit later. But indexing got us on our way. We grew very rapidly, 25% a year in the late 80s. Even as you grow bigger, the rate slows down. In the 90s, we grew at about 17% a year. That's cash flow only, not counting the market impact. And we're now growing about 8% a year. But when you think about 8 or 7% a year growth, and you have $3 trillion worth of assets, which is where we've come from that original billion, the growth rate has to slow down. But still, even at 7% of 3, that's $210 billion of assets that come in order to maintain that 7% growth rate. And in fact, that's almost exactly the amount of assets we took in last year, the largest inflow of cash in the history of the mutual fund industry. So we're kind of flying here, and we got plenty of challenges. And I might just say, I think importantly, some of the things that the main thing that has driven our growth, and that is, and this is going to sound egotistical, but only because it is, kind of a little bit of a view into my philosophy. So if we can put that chart up, Bogle philosophy, or path to industry leadership it's called, and let's just spend a minute on that. The first rule is strategy follows structure. And I talked about that in great detail in my article in the Journal of Portfolio Management, that 40-year article. It's called Lightning Strikes, about the growth of Vanguard and indexing, and how that has changed the nature of the industry. And it's a long article in the 40th anniversary edition. But strategy follows structure, and if you have a structure, as we did, the unique structure of running funds for their shareholders rather than for their managers, we are truly a mutual company, and the only one in the industry. Your strategy kind of lays itself out pretty easily. I'll come to that in a sec with another chart, and I'll amplify that. Just remember the key word, and key phrase here is strategy follows structure. Next comes kind of the human touch. Very important, very easy. When we had a much smaller $1 billion, we started off with 28 crew members, counting me, and but still this philosophy has been part of my life all along. The idea is to focus on our clients, honest to God, as I say, down-to-earth human beings, each with their own hopes and fears and financial goals, and strive to give them a fair shake. And that's what Vanguard is all about. Well, when we're doing that, we can't forget the people who are serving those clients. So don't forget the Vanguard Crew is rule 3, from the highest to the humblest. And I like to work to this day, and do every day, with the people that are down the line at Vanguard. The management, I think, is not particularly smitten to have the old guy around, but the crew here are really great people, and I talk to them, interact with them literally every single day. My rule, when we finally got to getting a personnel department back in probably 1978 or 9, personnel, by the way, is now human resources, I guess, and it was hire nice people and tell them to hire nice people. And that works pretty well, particularly if you never forget that loyalty is a two-way street. How many companies do you see out there that say, I want our people to be loyal to us, and forget their duty to be loyal to those that are working there? Just look parenthetically about the number of companies that are taking away, making it much harder for their employees. And we don't even use the word employees, we use crew members. Take away from their employees their medical benefits and hold the lid on costs at the expense of the people who are building the company. They don't forget the executives, but they forget the people that are doing all the hard work. Next, and very key to this, number 4, is always, from the very beginning, I was using this phrase with our staff, we wanted to offer funds with high relative predictability versus their peers, so you wouldn't depart too much from the pack. Today it's called high R squared, coefficient of determination, or how much of the fund's return is explained by its market average, appropriate market average or peer group. And all of our funds, with very few exceptions, are up in the 95 to 99 range, even the actively managed funds. So keep it predictable. That keeps the money from pouring in when you have great performance, which we will never have, and pouring out when we have bad performance, which we will also never have. You eliminate the extremes, and therefore the terrible behavioral problems investors have of buying what's hot right when it's hottest and then selling it when it grows cold. So if you're average in gross return, you win on net return because you have low cost. So you can win by about 1.5 points a year just on cost, 1.5 percentage points. And if you do that, your typical fund will pretty regularly outperform its competitors at 1.5% a year by 25% over a decade. And I tell people, look, if 25% over a decade isn't good enough for you, you should probably look for some genius out there. Finally, how much time is spent on marketing? This is an industry where it used to be focused on stewardship, and now it's focused on salesmanship. It used to be focused on management, and now it's focused on marketing. So I had 2 rules from the very beginning. I'm a big market share hawk, by the way. I'm not trying to say I don't care about it. I care about it deeply. But it's a measure and not an objective, first and foremost. And second, it must be earned and not bought. You don't buy your way into market share. You earn your market share by good service, good performance, good shareholder relations, integrity in operations, good people to talk to on the telephone, and people to understand the company's value system. And that's what it's all about at Vanguard. And this is a shorthand kind of thing, inevitably, but I think those are the important points. And now with one more chart, then we'll open up to some questions, and we're ready for a lot of them. I want to go to strategy follows structure, and next one, strategy follows structure. Strategy follows structure. I thought we had this locked. We'll be there. Not in there? That's not going to be helpful. Let me, I have a chart here in front of me that didn't make the deck, so let me just try and describe it to you. Okay, what about if you're a mutual? Let's compare the Vanguard strategy and structure with a typical mutual fund management company. In the Vanguard structure, you have a mutual organization. high priority then for, and your strategy is to prioritize the interests of fund shareholders. With that comes pricing, lower costs for fund owners. And for us, that averages about 18 basis points. If we have lower costs, the impact on investors is higher profits. The impact on the manager is lower revenues and profits. The long-term result is market share increases. Now, I'm sorry I don't have the chart. Let's just go to that model, to the industry model. It's prioritize the management company at price as high as whatever traffic will bear, higher cost for fund owners. Right now, that number looks to be about 108 basis points, 1.0%, 1.08%, and that's essentially 100 basis points, a full percentage point higher than the annual cost to Vanguard shareholders, using expense ratios only. Now, if you have no loads, as we do, if you have low portfolio turnover costs, which you have minimal in index funds and low in our other funds. One of our funds, Prime Cap, only turns over 3% a year. I love that. Then when you have higher costs, you have lower profits to fund investors. This is the competitors. Higher revenues and higher profits to the manager. And the long-term result is decreasing market share. And that's what I mean by earned and not bought. So let me, I think, pause there a little bit. And let me add one thing. When I saw your syllabus, which I'm going to find here in a sec, I noted that, that's it, thanks, that Dr. Tower's syllabus, when you get to the second page for you students, you get to the first book he mentions, which is Bogle on mutual funds, and 1992. And the curious thing is that right before me, really at this desk, because I've been working on it this very morning, is a new introduction to Bogle on mutual funds, my 1993 book, tremendous bestseller, endorsed by Warren Buffett, Peter Bernstein, and Paul Samuelson, and just about everybody else respected in this industry. Most of them called it even better than Benjamin Graham's Intelligent Investor, which I'm not sure I would accept that, but it's really nice for somebody to think it. And so that book came out, and I'm working on a new forward to a classic edition of that book with about a 25-page introduction. And then, curiously enough, Dr. Tower's closing book is Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. And this is really funny because as I read over the syllabus last evening, as soon as I saw it, it hit me like a ton of bricks, because I'm right now working on about a 30-page essay about Adam Smith, to be published by Princeton University Press. Probably they're a little slow on the university press side, but maybe in the fall of this year if we're lucky. It's got about 25 chapters, and my chapter is called Adam Smith and Shareholder Capitalism. And so I keep my eye on the academic side of things, on the economics of the business, which is where I got my original training at Princeton University, and where I wrote my thesis on the mutual fund industry. So I feel like my kind of past is sort of closing in on me. You know, I've been to begin with my first book, I end with my latest essay, and it's fun to come full circle. Although lest you muse about that, I don't think my circle is completed yet. I'm going to keep at it with all the energy at my command, which diminishes as you get old, no question about that. Maybe I should say older. And you know, you need a little bit more rest. You have plenty of energy, but maybe for shorter periods of time. And complete working on my mission to turn this investment society from an intermediation society, which we now have institutions control 70% of all the stock in America, and they aren't doing anything about it. They have to do, from an intermediation society to a fiduciary society, and that's my latest mission. So with that, happy to try some questions. We'll throw up some more charts. They will be useful, and it's, again, great to be with all of you.
you very much, Jack. And just to let people know when you ask questions, our video is coming from that camera right next to the clock. So for people who have questions for Jack, I know you can see our video down there, how small it is in the corner. But bottom line is, direct your question to the clock. Maybe just come right here, look at the clock, ask your question, and that'll give him a fighting chance to see you. So with that, who's got questions for Mr. Bogle? I know the students do, for sure. Yes, please, Henry. This is a local Boglehead, Henry.
Mr. Bogle, it's an honor to have a chance to talk to you. There's been an argument that the index funds have the concept of buying high and selling low, in that the rebalancing that goes on, say, index 500 fund is tied to market cap. So as the stock gets more expensive, it becomes a greater percentage of the index, and vice versa. And then there's all these new so-called smart beta funds out there, for example, that would equally weight all the funds in the index. What are your thoughts about that?
Sure. First, let me say, I wish I had a chart for this, and I don't. But visualize that kind of thing cannot happen. Let's start with that. It's not going to happen, if you will. And that is because visualize the U.S. stock market, the entire stock market today, in a circle, a pie chart. And 1/3 of that pie chart, roughly today, 33%, is held by index funds, either pension funds or mutual funds, largely mutual funds, but the pension funds are very much in indexing too. And they capture the market return minus, let's say, 0.5% on average, 5 basis points. So in a 7% market, they're going to get a 6.95% return. Now, the other 2/3 of the market is the same index fund. It's all the rest of the market. There's the total stock market index fund. And if an index fund, for example, the index funds own $1 worth of General Motors, the other investors own $2 worth of General Motors. And $1 worth of Google, $2 worth of Google, whatever it might be, stock by stock through the list. Twice as much is not indexed as is indexed. So you can't divorce the two. You can say, okay, that there might be a manager over there that can do better. And the index may be a little bit flawed, but it's changing prices not only on the index side, but on the active side, because they both have the same stocks, the same prices at the same time. So they are one and the same. They are a unity. It's 1/3 of the stock market owned by indexers, and the 2/3 of the stocks owned by non-indexers. But the problem with non-indexers is they're going to get the same 7% return by definition, and they're going to pay 2% for that, and that means they're going to end up with a net 5% return, maybe a little more than that, but around 5%. Doesn't sound like much in a year, but compounded over a lifetime, it's going to mean that for each dollar the active investors earn, the pure index investors are going to earn $3, 3-to-1 advantage over a lifetime. You know, you just can't, there's no way around that. If the index is flawed, the market is flawed, and I think people lose sight of this equality of the index book over here and the active book over here. They are the same.
I guess my question wasn't as clear. It wasn't about active versus index investing. It was models of creating the index you're going to invest in. So it would still be done in a passive, automatic way to try to keep the cost very low, but it'd be using a different criteria than market.
I have it. I got it.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're talking about, just to be clear, you're talking about what we call, or they call, fundamental indexing, things like that?
Yes.
And how about, while I'm on it, how about smart beta, of which there is no such thing, and of which Dr. William Sharp, Nobel laureate, calls. He said, what do you think of smart beta? And he says, I think smart beta is stupid. Smart beta is nothing. You know, if there's somebody that can find a better way, there is somebody else that will find a worse way. Now let me go to the particulars. The fundamental indexers, whether it's Rob Arnott or Jeremy Siegel, two of the biggest names in that field, believe that by weighting stocks by, not by their market prices, but by their dividends or by their fundamental value, dividends, earnings, book values, and the like, we're not clear exactly what, they can do better than a standard index. It's an interesting theory. It actually is not without some rationale, but it doesn't work. They've had almost a decade to prove that it worked. It has not. The Arnott fund is a little bit ahead of the S&P 500, a little bit behind the more accurate comparison, which is the mid-cap stock index, and Jeremy's is the dividend index, and he's a little bit behind in both cases. But the Arnott fund has a higher volatility, a little bit higher, and Jeremy Siegel's fund has a little bit what wisdom tree it's called, a little bit lower volatility. So, you know, who am I to say that won't work in the future? Nobody knows that. But I don't see how, when you think about it broadly, any new way of approaching the market can possibly succeed in the long term. Because if, in fact, think about this for a minute, if, in fact, value stocks and small cap stocks, as distinct from growth stocks and large cap stocks, have an advantage, it will only be a matter of time until investors recognize that, bidding the prices of value and small cap up, and bidding the prices of large and growth down. So they will equalize. So it might work for a while, but the fact is it hasn't worked. The data, they don't have the data on their side. And if you look back for years, this is in the wisdom tree presentation, you know, value did much better for a long time, and growth did much better for a long time. Then growth plummeted in the early 2000s. Value came back, and ever since they started those funds, growth and value have been just about the same. So I don't see it in the numbers, and that to me is logical that I don't see it in the numbers. But, you know, you're still going to have, these guys are great marketers, and they're going to tell you it's going to work. And I said from the very beginning, I can't tell you whether it'll work or not. But if you were guaranteed your fair share of the market return, let's say compared to your neighbors, that's the total stock market value, you might do a little bit better. It's not going to be a lot better because they all own the same funds, just in different weights, pretty much. Same stocks, I should say. And so you're guaranteed to capture the market's return with a standard market evaluated index fund. And these funds, I admit, could do better. They could do worse. That's probably a 50-50 bet. But there are long odds they will do pretty much the same. And they're more expensive, which is the problem.
Well, I might just say that I've written with Duke students 2 papers on fundamental indexation. And we've looked at Rob Arnott's index funds, we've looked at Jeremy Siegel's, and we've looked at the fundamental index funds done by dimensional fund advisors. And we compared those with Vanguard's index funds. Vanguard has some value and some growth. Tried to, and some neutral, and we tried to get comparable funds. And we found, we did 6 different calculations. On 3 of them, the fundamental funds came out behind. On 3 of them, they came out ahead. So I didn't see that anything, that these did anything particularly special. And and Rob Arnott, as Jack says, did rather better than the others. And so we're in complete agreement. But I love working with Duke students on these projects.
Yeah, let me just add to that, Ed. Thank you, Dr. Tower. But let me add to that, not to be too tough a guy, but I am. And that is, if someone says, I have a way that is sure to beat the market, I put my hand over my wallet.
have written some very nice questions for Jack earlier on in the week, and perhaps some of you would care to ask Jack some of those questions that you wrote down.
Hi. Yeah. Here comes somebody. Oh, from the back. I have a question on something you just actually said. What percentage do you think the market could sustain being an index fund? I know you mentioned that it was about 33% right now. Do you think there's kind of some sort of limit as Vanguard grows and as other index funds enter, where the market won't sustain having such a large number in these low management, very hands-off index funds? Thanks.
Sure, that's a very good question, a very fair question. It's 33%, as you say, and as I said, and it's growing. And is there a stopping point? Well, let me just say to give you a simple, I don't think there's any realistic limit to what percentage can be indexed. And the reason for that is that, well, one reason for it is when I came into this business, the stock market turned over at about 25% a year. Now, I'm going to oversimplify this answer a little bit because I think it'll be clearer. Now the stock market turns over at 250% a year, 10 times as much. If half were indexed, this is an oversimplification, but to make the point easy, if half the market were indexed, today's turnover would drop from 250% to 125%. That's still plenty of turnover, 5 times as much as it was back in 1951. And yes, conditions are different, and institutions are bigger. I understand all that. But the point is, we don't need all this turnover to make the market work. And as a reality here, I think the main implication of indexing become really super powerful. Let me say 65, let me say 2/3 of the market, which is a long, long, long way away. I think the implication of that is clearly, crystal clearly, not that that will make the market inefficient and allow active managers to win, because that is not possible. Active managers, half of them will win, half of them will lose. So the implication of a much more powerful percentage in indexing, if it were to make the market less efficient, again, which I doubt, would be to make it easier to beat the market and easier to lose to the market. So if today a really good manager for a period of a decade can win by, let me say, 2 percentage points, and those decades don't recur, by the way, and a really bad manager, I'll leave costs out of this, loses by 2 percentage points, maybe over a decade, when indexing is operating much larger and theoretically at least less efficient market, maybe the winning manager could win by 3 basis points, that 3% a year, and the losing manager would lose by 3% a year. And of course, when you take the cost into account, that 3% for the winning manager becomes 1%, taking the 2% cost down, and 3% for the losing manager gets 2% of costs added, so he's losing by 5. So you get this asymmetry that you can't do anything about, where the winners have less to gain because of cost than the losers have to lose. But before cost, they're about the same. So I don't see a problem there. Don't think I don't look for it. If I can find a critical article about mutual funds, an argument that makes any respectable argument, particularly from academic sources, unbiased academic sources, I pore over it and over it and over it to see if I'm missing something. So far, I don't think I have missed anything, but don't ever think that I don't worry about it. Anybody that thinks you've got the world by the tail, maybe they may have another thing coming all too soon. So you've got to be very careful of complacency. I'm probably sort of subject to that. You may observe that in my presentation today. But there we are. You challenge yourself. You stick close to academia, which is where really the index fund idea was implemented. Sanos article, and I've done that ever since. And I find it a very important part of my ability to understand this business.
Well, I'm still looking for questions from you folks, but since I don't see any, I'll make a remark. Jack Bogle has written, in the mutual fund business, you get what you don't pay for. He's also talked to us about niceness. You really care about whether your mutual fund manager is nice? He also has a book called Character Counts. You really care about the character of the people who are managing your funds, or do you just want them to make smart decisions? Well, a few years ago, with a PhD student, I wrote a paper called Moral Turpitude in Mutual Fund Families. And what we discovered was that the mutual fund families that rip you off in obvious ways, that have front-end loads, that have back-end loads, have high expenses for their most preferred. We looked at how well these mutual funds companies did by their clients. And we discovered that even aside from the front-end loads, the back-end loads, the expense ratios, their gross returns were way under the mutual funds that didn't charge front-end loads, back-end loads, and had tiny expense ratios and also tiny turnover. And that, in fact, for every 1 percentage point increase in the expense ratio, the gross returns were 1% smaller. So these guys who are ripping you off in obvious ways were ripping you off in more subtle ways as well. And so I think Jack missed the boat when he said that in the mutual fund business, you get what you don't pay for. In fact, I think he should have said you get twice what you don't pay for. And so I'd like to know what Jack's response to that is. Oh.
Yes, he missed.
Okay, so something's happened.
Can you still hear us? Yeah. Oh, dropped out. Jack, can you still hear us?
Let me just add it. I have a pretty good sentence, a little bit sharp and acerbic. I've been known to do that. Yes, I'm going to see if I can respond. It's a little bit uneven here, but let me just respond a little bit to whether I've made it clear. And I think you were referring maybe to the study I did on stewardship quotient, where I rated a whole bunch of fund managers as to how they did on expenses, portfolio turnover, independence of directors, all kinds of things. I think there were 15 or 20 different stewardship items, and everybody ended up with a stewardship score. And I did find the lower the stewardship score, which is subjective, of course, the poorer the performance was overall. But I have made that into sharp language, Ed. This is what I'm not maybe a little bit apologetic about, but not really. Because sometimes you've got to hit somebody over the head with a sledgehammer to get their attention. But my saying was, in the mutual fund industry, you not only don't get what you pay for, you get precisely what you do not pay for. And therefore, if you pay nothing, you get everything. And that sums up the index argument as well as I'm able to do so.
If the little side, Mr. Bogle, I'm curious what your opinion is if you, like, for example, a lot of people in this room are potentially very interested in investing and finance and economics and so on, but many of our family members, friends, loved ones, that kind of thing, maybe not so much. And to a large extent, I think many people can fall sort of victim to the Wall Street marketing machine and be, taken by fairy tales from Wall Street marketers. And I guess my question is kind of twofold, which is just generally, how would you suggest that we can encourage fellow investors to maybe go towards the indexing route and not be taken by the Wall Street marketing machine? Then kind of the second part to that question is, if that involves a book or two, maybe you have a recommended book, not of your own, and maybe a recommended book of your own to help with that effort. Thank you, Mr. Bogle.
Well, then let me take the easy part of that first. Recommended books. I certainly recommend Bill Bernstein's book, Dr. William Bernstein, the rock doctor. He's a neurologist and an investment advisor out on the West Coast. And his book is called The Four Pillars of Investing. He has several books about that are very good. I'd also recommend my friend Dr. Burton Malkiel's book, A Random Walk Down Wall Street. And another friend of mine, Bill Schultheis, if you want to get really down to earth for someone that's not into this business, has a fine book called The Coffee House Investor. And so there are, and you know, the list goes on and on. I mean, I probably have the Bogleheads actually have a recommended list on their website. So I don't think I'll go beyond those few because, you know, you can only read so many things. They would all be excellent. I think Random Walk is now in its, I don't know, 10th edition maybe. And so it's passed the classic test as my first book, Bogle on Mutual Funds, did. And, you know, having just written this new foreword to Bogle on Mutual Funds, it's a 22-year-old book. And honestly, this is awful. But I'm really impressed with it. And in particular, you know, how many books about investing survived 22 years without really having to change a word? And so when I looked it over, I was particularly struck by something you may not have noticed, and that is the subtitle of the book is New Perspectives for the Intelligent Investor. And in that book, I have 3 new perspectives. And the amazing thing is, these were unusual and new in 1992, and today they're in the dogma. They're in the conventional mainstream. They're kind of, as I say in my introduction, they're kind of old hat, but they weren't that in 1993. So of course I'm pleased with that. One is index funds. They were a new perspective in 1992, and I think around that time, maybe we're, let me say, 6% or 7% of Vanguard's assets. I used the number before, but something in that range. And now they're 71. And they used to be maybe, probably in that year, maybe 5 to 10% of industry assets, and now they're 33% of industry assets. And of course, Vanguard is half of that market share, roughly. So it was a new perspective then, and outlined in just the way and with just the words that I do now. And you look at the data that I used to show the index fund advantage, use the arguments I used, I repeat them in this new introduction I'm writing. It's amazing how far we've come. When you come, that's a speech I gave, I think out in Washington State University years ago, was index funds from heresy to dogma. And that is what has happened. The second was, and this was new then. This is the funny thing. You're going to say, this guy's crazy. This couldn't have been new then. Well, it was new then. The second perspective was pay attention to your mutual fund costs, and particularly your expense ratios. And I provided a lot of data that showed how important it was and how it determined played a big role in determining your returns, whether it was an index fund or not an index fund, and gave plenty of examples to drive home the point is look at costs. And the interesting thing about that is I've been talking in that book, well, for probably forever, but certainly I wrote about it 22 years ago. And Morningstar used to think that their rating system was the best way to select mutual funds, buy the 4 or 5 star funds, avoid the 1 and 2 star funds kind of thing. And they finally conceded a few years ago that in fact paying attention solely to cost provided better outcomes than using their rating system. And that's some concession, and it certainly speaks marvelously to the integrity of Morningstar, not to defend the lost position, but to bring on the new position and accept it and endorse it. And the third one was tax efficiency, taxes in mutual funds. Mutual funds, believe it or not, grew up as an industry where investors love to get capital gains distributed. They always called them dividends, and we in the industry called them dividends. That's not exactly true. until the SEC and NASD, National Association of Securities Dealers, the old FINRA, wouldn't allow you to combine dividend income and capital gains with dividend income, capital returns with income returns. You had to separate them, and that was obviously a big plus thing. But in those days, say, I'm happy to declare an extra dividend, and here's 30 cents. That got the industry through the 30s, actually, paying out capital gains when they had them, and then, God forbid, paying out capital surplus distributions, which were tax-free, but put something in the shareholder's pocket. There's nothing really wrong with that, except it's misleading. It doesn't cost anybody. It's not taxable. But so when you have to pay attention to taxes, you start to look at things like the newly developing IRAs, newly developing corporate defined contribution plans, newly developed Roth IRA, which would come along much later. Municipal bond funds. The first municipal bond funds were only started in 1978. Make a distinction between how much income you had compared to, if you're a high income bracket. Municipal bonds are basically a license to steal, and if you're not, you buy corporate bonds, and you may want to put corporate bonds in your tax deferred account, and you may want to put municipal bonds in your taxable account, that kind of thing. So it got to be kind of nuanced, and so when I was talking about it 22 years ago, it was like, wow, this is something I'd never thought about. And so in those three perspectives alone, I don't know what was going on in my poor mind. But, I think it comes down to, I don't know how to express this in a non-self-serving way, but I think it goes into, if you just sit your tail down and think for a minute, you're apt to produce something worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Bogle, if you have said that you're not absolutely certain that your method is always going to be true or is true, would a well-advised investor who has enough resources be smart to use index funds for part of?
Yeah, we lost the first part on the audio.
Yeah.
We lost the first part of the audio. Could you repeat that beginning, just where you were there?
Since you have said that you're not absolutely certain that indexing is, and indexing in the way that you would market cap is absolutely the proper way to go, and that somebody might come in with a better way, should a smart investor diversify by using index funds for some investments and using some entirely different methods for other assets?
Sure, that's a great question. And, I have a mind that if not exactly open, is usually ajar. And I have some, I said actually in my book, Little Book of Common Sense Investing, which has been extremely popular for it's in fact been the #1 mutual fund book on Amazon for 8 years now. Amazing to me. And I do say in there that I'm talking mainly about how you use serious money. Put your serious money in an index fund. We'll talk just about equity money here at the moment. And then put 5% in your funny money account and see which does best. And I say in that book, in the book, I'm sure, confident that if you look at the returns of both after 5 years, you'll then move out of the funny money, everything into the serious money. Now, some people may not do that, and then they continue to invest in funny money. And I don't mean funny money in a derogatory way. It's not exactly swings of the fences, except that if an investor said, look, I'm 95% indexed, and I every once in a while I see a stock that I think is a good value, go do it. It's not going to hurt your returns, and it will give you a much better intellectual foundation for what you're doing. In some cases, a huge minority, it will work, but in most cases it won't. Now, maybe more in the spirit of your question rather than the letter, let's take an investor who says I'm 50% indexed, and I want to invest in a few active funds. I wouldn't tell you not to do that, but I'd say be careful about active funds. Be careful in this way. Look for funds with very low costs on their own. Do it with no load funds. Do it with funds that have low turnover. And do it with funds that have been around for a while. And take your chances. Now, those kind of funds usually are not spectacular. And I would say do not, under any circumstances, think that you can pick the best mutual funds for tomorrow based on how the funds did yesterday. The past is an industry in which the past is not only not prologue, but is really anti-prologue. And you go through, as I do in my book, Clash of the Cultures, Speculation versus Investment. That's my last book, my 10th book, 2013. I say in there, I show in there at the end, probably the 10 most popular, famous funds of the last decade, and decade up to 2013. And I take them all the way back. No, I take them all the way back through the modern era of the fund industry. And every one of them reverts to the mean after good performance. Every single one of them. T. Rowe Price Growth Fund hit its peak relative to the market index in 1970. Think about that. And has been an average fund ever since. It was the hottest fund in the industry in 1970. And done nothing for essentially the next 44 years. Magellan Fund, notorious, was sensational, a little bit of an overstated record. I think even Fidelity would admit that, up until 1992. And hit its peak relative to the industry, relative to the market, in 1992 or 3, and has been going downhill ever since. Our U.S. Growth Fund, same thing. You know, this happens everywhere. That's where I got off the boat of trying to hit the ball out of the park, trying to be relatively predictable. And you can look at CGM funds. They're quite Janus funds. They all hit their peak and go away. And the problem with that is this bad behavioral problem that investors should be aware of so as to protect themselves from it, of jumping on the winning bandwagon and seeing what happens from there, because it's almost always bad. This reversion to the mean. As the good book says, the last shall be first and the first shall be last.
Can you hear me, Jack?
I gave it a try. I think
so. Jack, I have a question about a retirement portfolio and the more recent research about, I guess it's from Professor Wade Ball, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, out of the American College, where they talk about the idea of starting off with a low equity position in retirement and having a rising glide path, equity glide path, so start from like a 20% and go up, as opposed to kind of the more traditional age-based equity position for retirement. I was wondering what your thoughts were about those ideas.
Did it work?
Were you able to hear me?
Yeah, I'm sorry, that's okay. I think Mike did it for me. Low equity and
Start at the time, increasing your equity position as you get older.
okay. Michael, I couldn't hear the video. Kind of let me down, but Michael picked it up. Starting retirement and building the equity ratio. Is that correct? As the retirement moves on.
Yeah, this is.
There aren't any answers to that. I personally would not do it. I'd pay a high price for safety, a high price for security. As you get to my age, I'm about 50-50 stocks and bonds, and I don't intend to change that very much, in part because if I were to change it, a lot of it could happen in my taxable account, and I'd have capital gains on the index equity funds that I have there because I never realized any. But it's, I think everybody's situation is different. You want to take into account the amount of money you have in one of your great investments, whether you know it or not, and that is in your Social Security account when you retire at age 65 or 70, and you have to start taking the money at 70, which is unfortunate mean, I waited until I was 70 to take it, and they keep sending it to me and get to pay taxes. But I did defer it until age 70. It was very wise. And so I have a nice check there. But it goes up with the cost of living. It's got an inflation hedge in it. And it is, I'm confident, hopefully confident maybe, that Social Security will be made intact. It will take very little to do it, to fix it. Very little, mathematics of long-term compounding are pretty easy to deal with short-term fixes because they compound over time. So you have that going for you as basically a bond investment with an inflation hedge, albeit not with any principal value when you die. And so I think I'd start with 50-50. I think about more and more in equities as I got older. But on the other hand, there's always somebody that wants some event, if you will, that wants to make you rethink your fundamental propositions. And I am always willing to do that. And, I got into this, have your bond position equal to your age. At the very beginning, bonds were yielding 7% and stocks were yielding 1%. So today, the intermediate term treasury is yielding 2%, and stocks are yielding a hair under 2%, maybe 1.9%. So the income gap is not there, and each person really has to work out for himself security. But I do believe that just about everybody, particularly older people, maybe entirely older, should have a certain money, what do we say, an anchor to windward, keep some powder dry. The yields are not great at all, but on the other hand, they should help to protect you when the market falls steeply. And the market could at any time go down 25 or 30 or 35% or 40%, or for that matter, 50%. Who really knows? So you got to be willing to stay the course, because when it goes up that much and then down that much, at the bottom is when the opportunity is. And I could see how scared to death people were after that 50% decline in 2009, and got out of the market. A lot of them did, and just before the market went up 200%. So I don't presume to give any answers. I do presume to say, try and protect yourself against errors of behavior, being captivated by the moment as compared to the long term. Because in the long term, so long as this nation grows and our GDP grows, companies will have gradually growing earnings, faster, slower, will follow that track. We're really talking about the economy of the nation and to some extent the economy of the world. And I have a conviction that this will be the best place to have money over the long term, this the United States of America. If anybody wants to argue with me, do it differently. But you may be right and I may be wrong. I've long ago ceased to think I have all the answers. You say, well, just do A, B, and C, it'll be fine. Just do what I tell you to do, and then don't peak, and wait for the checks to come in. Depend on income generation, Social Security, bonds, and stocks, and not on the values of the stock market as it carries them up and down. That's just mere speculation and noise.
Well, we are nearing the end, and so I think we have time for one more question, and then we should close. And we'll let Henry have another crack at Jack here.
Mr. Bogle, what do you think about both TIPS and Roth IRAs in a retirement portfolio?
What do I think about Roth and IRA portfolios as distinct one from the other, or?
Roth IRAs as put as much as you are able to.
Oh, and TIPS and IRA. Well, the TIPS are kind of a mystery to me. And right now, the TIPS are saying that I think the yields on 10-year TIP is very close to zero, and it will fluctuate more or less with government bonds. I think the advantage of a TIP today, and we really shouldn't be at the moment, and I shouldn't be at the moment as much as in the long term. But the reality is that we're going to be, I think we are inevitably in a long period of very light inflation, and maybe even, I hope not, but even deflation. So I would think the TIPS are about fairly valued relative to the taxable bonds of the same maturity.
So for diversification, do you think it's a good idea, or it doesn't really matter?
So that would be, in short, probably flip a coin.
And Roth IRAs versus traditional?
Well, I think Roth is absolutely the way to go if you're young. I didn't do it in the cost of converting my regular IRA or my Vanguard retirement plan to a Roth would have been horrendous, the tax cost. But for younger people, that's absolutely what I would do. And you're taking your chances. Will it still last? Will the tax benefits still last? That's a chance I would take, yes.
And would you count Social Security as part of your fixed income allocation, or would you just put that on the shelf and whatever percentage you want to otherwise have, not include the Social Security anticipated payments?
I didn't get that at all.
Would you include Social Security in the fixed income portion of an investor's portfolio, or would you just put it on the shelf and not include it when you figure out what percentage you want to be in equities versus fixed income?
Social Security as a bond.
Yeah, well, Social Security is a bond-like investment. It's certainly not a bond investment. It's a bond-like investment, that is a principal value. The capitalized value of your Social Security for a typical investor before retirement is some $300,000 to $400,000. That's the value of those future payments. Obviously, if you die the next day, the capitalized value is zero, very close to zero. So but it does have a cost of living hedge, and it's just a matter of understanding exactly what it does. But the main thing is, if I have a single focus I'd like investors to do, it's how much that check that comes into your mailbox twice a month, once from your mutual fund account or retirement plan account, once from your Social Security. You want to make sure that check can hold its own or even grow, as it will with Social Security, and should, in terms of mutual fund dividends, grow. And you want to make sure that check is there. That's the most important thing to you. And do your best to ignore these insane gyrations in market value the stock market gives us, just because all those speculators out there love to trade back and forth. So it's a stay the course. That's a good place for me to end, I think. Stay the course and press on regardless. Two of my favorites. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jack. Thanks to Mike Nolan for setting this up, and Kimberly Brown on our end. Thank you, Bogleheads, for great questions. Thank you, students and faculty for coming, and of course, Steve, and of course, ultimately, Jack. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, always.
Have a great day, Jack. And Mike.
Yeah. Funny, when it's not interactive, you're like, no. All the books are. Hey. Great work. More than one. That's right. You would have won a first time. Nobody else. Yeah, you know.
Thinking about you, so I thank you.
Oh, come on.